Greetings, and welcome to the Modern Alchemist channel. I'm Aubrey Forrest, the Modern Alchemist, and this is Essentials of Practical Alchemy 2019, Mythology and Magic. Today, on Mythology and Magic, we are going to talk about time. Are you ready? I'm ready. Let's begin.
Shall we begin? Let's begin now.
Today's dialogue in Essentials of Practical Alchemy, we're going to be talking about time. We've talked about time in the past, but it's time that we talk about time a little bit more. and solidify some of the ideas that I've shared with you in the past and clarify them. Furthermore, I think that with the passing of the Chinese New Year, we could then apply our dialogue about time to that and see what we can learn about why a lunar calendar at any time at all would have any kind of advantage over a solar calendar. What is time? Time, as we've learned in Alchemy Lab and our discussion of the Kabbalion and the principle of rhythm, time is the observation of the rhythmic passage of events in sequence. So when looking at the moon, you look at it and you might commence the lunar cycle with it being a new moon, meaning the moon is not there, it's eclipsed. And then as you get to the full moon, then you know that 15 days approximately have passed. And then by the time you get to the end of the lunar cycle, where it's a new moon again, you're seeing the conclusion of that cycle at approximately 27.3 days if you're using sidereal counting, which means you're looking at the moon relative to the stars around it. Or if you're using synodic counting, which is the moon relative to the sun, then it's at 29.5 days. That it takes for it to orbit. And of course the days are measured with the rotation of the Earth, right? So a 24-hour period, and that times 29.5. So when we're looking at time, it's a lot of counting, right? Without the counting, there would be no time. And here's an example of this. Let's do this thought experiment for a minute, and you'll see exactly what I mean. Imagine yourself within a universe that is populated only with you. That's it. And there's not a lot of you. It's just you, just one of you. And there's nothing else, just you. If you weren't equipped with your watch or a cell phone or some other clock or means of counting, right, and that counting based on whatever it is using, a mechanical mechanism or a passage of electrons, right, through a crystal, whatever the method is, that's not available to you, it's just you. So could you tell me, after a period of unknown expanse, could you tell me how much time had passed? Well, the answer is no. No, you can't. So what would be needed? Well, in this universe, you have the ability to create gumball machines. And so you pop a gumball machine out. Boom, there's a gumball machine. And periodically, this gumball machine auto-feeds a single gumball to you. So you're waiting around, and then boom, another gumball comes out, and another gumball comes out. And could you tell me, based on just the single machine, what period of time does it take for the gumballs to come out? And the answer is no. No, you can't. You can only say that gumballs come out and there's a period of whatever that takes place in between the gumballs popping out, because you can't really call it seconds or minutes because it's just a period, and you can't really judge how long the period is because you just have one gumball machine and no other means in the universe to determine what's happening. Well, after some period of time, another gumball machine comes out, and this gumball machine also expends gumballs, and where the first gumball machine expends 1, the second one, for every 1 the 1 expends, it expends 12. And so there's 1, and then the second one starts dispensing them, and you get 12, and then another 1 drops out of the first one. So at that point, you've got a ratio, right? 1 to 12. And you can kind of look at that and go, well, I have a ratio of 1 to 12, but I still can't tell you how much time. Only that this has a rhythm that has a ratio of 1 to 12 relative to the other thing. And the moment that you have other objects in your universe, you have relativity. And I'm not talking about Einsteinian relativity. I'm saying that things correspond to other things. So there's no bending of time, because time cannot be bent, because you're only counting things. So let's add another couple gumball machines, and the next one you dispense, for every 1 gumball that comes out of the one that's dispensing 12, you get 30 coming out of the third one. And for every 1 coming out of the 30, you get 24 dropping out of the fourth one, right? So now you're getting an idea. I'm patterning our gumball machines after a kind of gumball clock that would seem familiar to you, right? So the 1 gumball, that's the first machine that's dropping 1 out at a time, that could be seen as years. And then the second one that's 12 at a time could be seen as months. And then the next one that's 30 at a time could be seen as days. And then the fourth one could be seen as hours. And we can just keep progressively creating more gumball machines. And as they dispense, we would then count cycles. And so if I was a Klingon, I would say that there were so many kilocams. and if I was a if I was a Dalek, I'd say there were so many rels. So either way, it's just one entity that has consciousness recognizing the rhythm and flow of the universe and counting. Beyond that, time does not exist. Beyond the sequence, it doesn't exist. And so the question is, what are we experiencing then as we have the sense of the flow of time, kind of like sand slipping through your fingers? And what it is you're experiencing the flow of consciousness as a living being, housed within living flesh that never once, not ever, ever, in the entirety of your entire life, is ever the same from moment to moment. It is constantly changing, constantly evolving and adapting and adjusting. Your body from birth to death never, ever, ever is the same. It's always different. And that flow of consciousness through your body is reminiscent of the flow of the universe, and it being experienced by you, a conscious being housed in the framework of living consciousness, observing these cycles and then attributing some kind of value to those cycles. But that's what time is all about. And the moment that you can free yourself from the idea that time is actually a thing, a dimension, rather than the observation of a process, you have greater access to the Akashic record, because now you know that if a thing is known, it can be known, and time is irrelevant. One final thing that I'd like to mention. There's a movie that exhibits this idea so elegantly that it actually, I've mentioned it before, the movie invariably at the one scene where she's doing it, where she's moving herself forward and grasping information from herself and from her own experience, that it is the movie Arrival. And I have to say it's outstanding in its application and expression of what time is, especially with regard to the entities, the aliens that she deals with, and the nature of their language being unrestrained in its composition or application in the dialogue of what time is and what things are. So if you want to go see a movie that'll make you smarter, that's definitely going to be a movie that'll make you smarter. And that's what time is all about. That's what it is. So, what can we see now in our current situation in our world, since we just had a Chinese New Year happen? What can we learn from this? What paradigms must have been in place at some point for us to have a lunar calendar in preeminence over a solar calendar? Well, let's explore that idea. One thing that we fail, I think, to appreciate sufficiently in our modern age is actually time itself. We just don't know how much we've done to the paradigm of time compared to what our ancestors enjoyed. This is because what we see time as was developed during the Industrial Age in Victorian England, where time was suddenly looked upon as something that could be measured, counted, paid for, that you could accumulate time, and that time meant money, that it equivocated to the expenditure of money, so that if you had more money, something could be done in less time. And all of these things were really, really codified into the consciousness of humanity during this period of our history. Never before did we have such an abundance of clocks ticking away and keeping track of where we were and when we were supposed to be there. Prior to this, in fact, a clock was an extraordinarily expensive device that was often kept solely in the custody of the Navy as a means of navigating accurately across the ocean. So, a good clock and a compass and points of reference and a map, and you can go everywhere. Without one of these items, navigation and trade become considerably more challenging. So these ideas and our concept of what time is today might seem unnatural to someone 2,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago, where the idea of what time was could almost be considered quite the opposite of what we see it as today. Today, we look at time as something that's finite and expended. Back in the day, time was seen as something that was eternal, renewing constantly, and so there was never an end of time. It always was there. As long as things existed, then there would be time to do things. So this idea, and then of course once we move into the 20th century, the idea of time goes through yet another mutation, where mathematicians requiring time as a component of their equations would then create time as its own dimension, as its own place, when in reality we understand simply by thinking our way through it and observation that time is not a dimension. Time is simply our way of counting the sequence of events as they play out as according to the principle of rhythm. So things start, things stop, things start, things stop, and gumballs are dispensed. So these are things that are important to consider when we move into our next dialogue, which is the fact that most people today don't realize, but a calendar was a big deal 2,000 years ago. A calendar that was accurate was an extraordinary big deal because of one reason. You could determine when would be the best time to plant food in the ground, when would be the best time to conduct certain harvests, when would be the best time to engage in saving up and storing up foods, and when would be the time to get rid of them. All of these things we take for granted today because we just have clocks everywhere and calendars everywhere and due dates everywhere. But there was a time when things were less certain. Now, one of the things that you should pay attention to then is the implication of the advent of a calendar. And the fact that certain cultures, like those found in Mesoamerica, the Incas, the Maya, the Toltec, the Aztec, each of these cultures obsess to an extraordinary degree at making their calendars hyper accurate. So accurate, in fact, that, we hear about this, on History Channel. These calendars rival, many of the calendars that we've developed with the aid of computers. So these all are components of this dialogue, and it puts into everything a particular frame of reference. When you consider that there was a time when these calendars were not employed, and then these calendars were developed and employed, and that you can track globally the progression of development of these calendar systems, so that on a global scale, the vast majority of cultures on the planet were looking at a lunar calendar as opposed to a celestial solar calendar. Most people kind of skim over that, and they're like, well, maybe they just didn't have the intelligence to set up a pillar in the ground and monitor the passage of seasons and, sundial, right? They didn't have the necessary intelligence to build a Stonehenge so they could demark the equinox and the solstice. And by knowing those 4 essential points in a solar calendar, you can conduct your business in an agrarian system where you know proper times of harvest and proper times of planting, etc. Today, with such a small grouping of people depending upon a calendar system to know when's the right time to plant food and when's the right time to harvest food, we're all so removed from that, we don't see the value necessarily as an immediate, oh yeah, that makes sense, unless we're thinking our way through it. So was there a time then that there was no solar calendar because perhaps we didn't have an orbit that was consistent? Is it possible that what is implied by the lack of a solar calendar and by what is implied by its development at the turn, at 0 BCE, when you begin to get a Julian calendar system, and then that several hundred years later develops into the Gregorian calendar system, both of which were solar? Is there something that is implied by that? I would suggest to you that there is. And what is implied is that our solar system had more than one star at the time. That immediately makes a solar calendar very difficult, because there's no way with a binary system that you could perhaps accurately determine what the orbital pattern of a planetary body might be. It might exchange hands between the 2 stars in a kind of figure 8 pattern. And can you imagine how disruptive this would be to the seasons and to periods that we take for granted today as being set and established, and that scripture and of every kind, every culture, when they talk about the final settling down of things and the creation of things, one of the first things they mention is, oh yes, and they created the seasons and times of year, that all of this was established as a component of this creation. The Bible's very specific about that the stars were placed in their positions so that we then know it's that time of year. And that's important. And to me, that says that at some point, this was unavailable, that we couldn't look up and determine that this new season was going to come on. And that maybe the only thing that could help you might be a consistent lunar orbit, where you could say, well, I've seen this moon passed by now 4 times, and maybe there was more than one moon, right? Which then puts into a different context the phrasing when you hear a native people say, when recounting an event, it took so many moons. Our assumption is the passage of the same moon. But what if we were in an environment where the passage of time was gauged by more than one satellite moving around and our observing of those passages of time. In that kind of context, we would have a completely different frame of reference, where a lunar calendar would probably be more advantageous, and nobody would consider a solar calendar, because there might be an argument as to which star are we going to use, and there might be a discussion as to which star is going to capture us and hold on to us for this period. I think there's just simply too much up in the air for an ancient people to go, yeah, we can rely upon this as being the new norm. This is the new normal. But there was a point when you can see that transition take place. It follows the last great cataclysm. And following that cataclysm, the solar system was made at one. In later traditions, we call that atonement, meaning all things brought together at one time. And that's exactly what happened. It puts biblical narrative into an entirely different light, because the light is the light of this star, the sun, having reconciled all of that mess into one singular solar system, upon which then we can look up and say, aha, now we have a solar calendar that we can count on, because there are no competing stars in the immediate vicinity that could pull that apart and make it something different. So to me, that then is the implication. That's what is implied by looking at lunar calendars as opposed to a solar calendar, and why it seems to have taken so long for the world to finally decide, yep, we're all going to go with that. All of us, because that makes sense. It makes more sense. But there was a time when we weren't in agreement, and people might have been waiting. I'm speaking 2,000, perhaps 4,000 years ago. Cultures and peoples might have been waiting to see if one of those stars would be renewed, if the phoenix would rise again from its ashes and alight the heavens again, right? So, and give us a binary star system instead of just our singular sun. That is what you can generate in terms of thinking when just applying it. Now, when we're looking at the lunar calendars, let's take a brief look at the Chinese calendar as an example of a possible paradigm shift that could have taken place over time. So, as many of you are probably aware, on February 5th, we celebrated, as planet Earth, the Chinese New Year, which is based on a lunar cycle. And what is fascinating to me is that, unlike the solar astrology, where it takes one full month for the sun to move from one constellation to the next within the zodiac, within the lunar calendar, the Chinese lunar calendar, their astrological calendar, it takes a year for you to progress from one sign to the next. And that's really cool to me for a number of reasons, but mostly because it just lights my imagination up, and I begin to draw correspondences, because I start thinking to myself, aha, where can I find another spot in the solar system where, if I were living there, it would take a full year for me to move from one constellation to the next? Well, I'd have to be in orbit around Jupiter and living there in that micro system. In fact, what is fascinating to me is now astronomers are beginning to reevaluate our solar system as perhaps not. And this is on the cutting edge. Give it time; it'll become more common. I've seen this happen, by the way. Little segue here, but I have watched science transition so many times in my life. You can almost see when it's about to happen. Currently, dark matter is dying on the vine, and we're going to stop hearing about dark matter pretty soon. because every single test that they've been doing and the hundreds of millions of dollars they've been spending to find it is completely wasted, and they found nothing. It's a big goose egg. Well, back in the day when I was a child, dinosaurs were cold-blooded. And then all of a sudden in the 80s, these guys started coming up and they're going, hey, you know what? Based on things like their track pattern and how they work and muscles and whatnot, they probably may have been warm-blooded. Certainly a high number of them were warm-blooded. And of course now we're looking at dinosaurs and we're like, oh yeah, dinosaurs were just like warm-blooded and not, not a surprise, right? But back in the day, that was a surprise. It was a big thing. Well, in the same context, we're finding that astronomers are looking at the solar system, especially after the Juno mission and the Cassini mission, and they're seeing our fruit salad hodgepodge solar system as not having generated at the same time. That in fact, what we could be looking at are three separate solar systems that have all kind of clumped together as a single system now. The exception is Jupiter. Jupiter, while it appears to be in orbit around the sun, the truth of the matter is Jupiter is technically not in a true orbit around the sun. Particle physicists, standard model physicists, evaluate this on gravitational terms, and so they say that the center of gravity with the larger body causes this somewhat strange orbit that you see animated here. However, if from the plasma universe perspective, what we're looking at are two celestial bodies, luminaries, one in dark mode, which would be Jupiter, and then one in full-on arc mode, which is the sun. And that these are two stars that are running parallel to each other like little drops of oil following threads, which are the universal Birkeland currents which are moving through the galaxy. And that they have essentially caught along a parallel line together, and so they move together. It's actually very cute, and it reminds me of any number of mythologies where you have two friends meet, and then the one guy's like, hey, where you go, I will follow, which literally is what you see with Jupiter, is that where the sun goes, Jupiter is following, but it's not orbiting, not like Earth or Mars or Saturn and the rest of them. It's its own little thing. And when you consider how many dozens of satellites are orbiting Jupiter, you get a completely different perspective on the composition of our solar system. Well, if we were living on one of those satellites and looking up into the sky and casting our natal charts, we would be casting the natal charts in 12-year groupings, not unlike the Chinese zodiac, where each of the signs are take a full year for you to progress through. So Jupiter passes through all the signs of the zodiac in 12 years. What that implies then is that the creation of that calendar was either done in an environment or a paradigm where looking up the annual zodiac progression made sense, which would imply then that those people were living in an environment where that was the case, where they were counting lunar cycles because there was more than one star, and they were looking at zodiac cycles because they were in a frame of reference that was similar to what we see Jupiter occupying today. That it really, to me, it gets exciting, because this then is evidence of a very compelling narrative that involves all of us here on planet Earth, and makes the mythologies that we read about become our story. It's not just some made-up hypothetical something or another. It's a codified, encrypted history of our solar system as we saw it while we were there observing it. And we learned this. We got to this point by simply contemplating the nature and implication of time and the methods that we have used to count it. All right. I hope that this has been a good Essentials of Practical Alchemy for you, and I've given you a whole lot to digest and process and think about, especially as you go through your day and you look at your clock and you count the time and you think about how much time you've been in places, and you realize that what you're doing is you're applying a abstraction, when you look at a clock, of a physical process that is taking place around you all the time, a rhythmic process that has starts and finishes and midpoints, and that process is ever changing, just as you are ever changing, and it makes everything so much more exciting. All right, I'm Aubrey Force, the Modern Alchemist, and this has been Essentials of Practical Alchemy 2019, Mythology and Magic. And today we talked about time. I'll be talking to you soon.